Hello, good morning, everyone. I am Eric Guidi, Managing Director of CFA Society San Francisco. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. We are delighted to welcome back to the Society Justina Lai from Wetherby Asset Management, who will share her experience with us. And we are very pleased to introduce Isabelle Araujo, CFA, a member of our Society and an active volunteer on our Young Leaders Council, who will be in conversation with Justina today. Thank you both for being here and tackling this important topic, which is top of mind for many of our investment professionals. All of you tuning in will be muted for today's event, but we welcome your questions via the Q&A box, and we will endeavor to answer as many as we can. Now, it is my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Isabelle.
Thank you, Eric, for the introduction, and thank you all for participating in the call today. It's a pleasure to host this webinar with the CFA Society San Francisco, and an honor to have this conversation with Justina Lai. Our topic in this investment is investment opportunities in the low carbon economy. And I'd like to start off with a number that surprised me. According to John Doerr in his book, Speed and Scale, it would require $1.7 trillion of investments for us to reach each year for the next 20 plus years, for us to reach a net zero economy globally. So it's indeed a huge challenge. And by the end of the session, we hope to have answered the question on how financial professionals and institutions can play a role in creating a low carbon economy. And thank you, Justina, for accepting our invitation. I'm sure this talk will help our community of investment professionals and leaders get ideas on how they can be part of fighting the climate crisis, and also better direct resources for a cleaner, more equitable, and better future overall. That said, we live in a time of great change. And I love this Chinese proverb that says that when the winds of change blow, some people build walls while other people build windmills. And it's with that in mind, I'd like to start the conversation. And for everyone in the audience, we'll have time for questions in the end. So Justina, could you please help us understand the current status of the broader context of impact investing as it relates to climate change? Maybe touching a bit on the importance of the having established carbon market, and also the role of the government incentives, and especially now that we have just passed a major regulation in Congress, the Inflation Reduction Act. So if you could comment a little bit on that.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. I mean, climate change is really a critical theme within the larger impact investing field, as the climate crisis really does present systemic risks and opportunities that are increasingly relevant to asset pricing, and really should not and cannot be ignored by any investor. But within the broader context of impact investing, if I could just get on my soapbox a little bit for a moment here, we do think it's also critical to think about impact at a systems level and recognize that climate and social justice are really inextricably linked. For example, we know that minority and low-income communities are much more likely to live adjacent to and downstream from toxic byproducts and pollution from power plants and waste management facilities and other sort of environmental hazards. And we really saw these unequal impacts and environmental injustice manifest in the disproportionate sort of death rates from COVID-19. And so we really think it's that we are much better prepared and will be more resilient to not only climate impacts, but also health and human impacts if we also address environmental injustices. And so there's a real opportunity to invest in those kinds of themes that are oriented around enabling a just transition from an economic system that's really extractive towards the one that's really regenerative. But with that said, to answer your question, climate change is really a growing focus within impact investing. It's evidenced by just the sheer dollar amounts invested each year. You mentioned the $1.7 trillion required each year. We did reach over $900 billion in 2021, as well as 1,000 climate-focused funds that have proliferated globally in response to the opportunity that's presented by the climate crisis. So, and just to speak to regulation, as you noted just a few months ago, Congress did pass the Inflation Reduction Act, which commits the US to spending hundreds of billions of dollars in budget outlays and tax breaks to speed the energy transition. For the past decade or so, or even longer, there's really been an absence of that kind of federal level support. And in the interim, the private sector has been filling that gap. But with this act, the U.S. is finally poised to play a major role in helping to drive clean energy technology forward globally. And it really provides policy certainty to companies and investors that previously haven't had that kind of certainty in investing in the energy transition, and hopefully incentivizes laggards to really catch up. And I would note that creating an enabling environment for climate investing is not just about incentives. We need a full suite of solutions, including, as you mentioned, a functioning carbon market, but also simpler, like very basic governmental things like permitting processes. So, the EU, for example, has a plan to address certain bottlenecks by requiring environmental permits to be issued within 2 years of an application, or finding ways to shorten any sort of lengthy court fights over prospective or potential projects. And here in the U.S., federal regulators have signaled an interest in tackling some of the same issues.
Perfect. Thank you, Justina. And do you think that how we can address those opportunities that you mentioned, that maybe investment in clean energy should be maybe more of a broad-based investment or more targeted investments? And how is this, I would also like to understand, how is this different from ESG investing and a D&I approach? And one final piece of the question: how do you hope to effectively influence the invested companies? How is this you're actively working with those companies to drive change?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's both and in terms of the broad-based and targeted approach that you mentioned. I think there's a real opportunity to address the climate opportunity across asset classes, and really thinking about it from a broad risk perspective, a risk lens, as well as the more targeted thematic opportunities. Climate really is all encompassing and will impact financial and economic systems broadly and systemically. So we're really thinking about it from both angles. In terms of sort of differences and similarities with ESG or impact and DEI broadly, I mean, from my perspective, the difference is that various ESG factors will have varying levels of real relevance and financial materiality depending on the business, the sector, and the geography. Whereas climate and DEI, I think about as more cross-cutting issues that will be material across companies, industries, and geographies. And so, the way that we think about the influence piece is thinking about it up and down the value chain, as we really do think we have a need to deploy a full ecosystem of approaches to be effective. So going beyond the placement of capital itself to also including active ownership, stewardship, and engagement, and public advocacy. So, just for example, we implement a full manager engagement program where we engage all of our managers, both traditional and impact, on ESG, DEI, and climate risks and opportunities. We also support our clients in filing shareholder resolutions on a range of topics, including climate risks and opportunities. And then finally, because this is really a collective action problem or something that we all need to take collective action on, we also work with investor coalitions and participate in industry level initiatives in order to move the field forward together.
Perfect. So, Justina, I'm understanding then that the topic will be important for all asset classes. So from an asset allocation perspective, what do you think would be the main trends in investments? Maybe clean tech, climate related investments. If you could share a little bit with us, what do you think would be the investment focus over the next 5 years?
So I might I might give a little bit of a cop-out answer here, because honestly, I think it's all hands on deck. I think what we're witnessing now is going to require a transformation, like a business model and economy-wide transformation that we really haven't seen since the Industrial Revolution. And so, we really do have a pretty short window of opportunity to limit ourselves to 1.5 degrees of warming. And as a result, we're really seeing a lot of innovation, not only in climate mitigation, but also now an increasing focus on adaptation and solutions for adaptation, because particularly in emerging markets where as unfortunately, as we know, many of these climate impacts are already being felt by countries that really weren't the ones who put the carbon in the atmosphere in the first place. So, we're seeing mitigation opportunities like alternative proteins, food waste reduction, carbon capture and storage and sequestration, a lot of innovation around materials. So like green steel, low carbon cement, green hydrogen in order to power blast furnaces, along with efficiency technologies. So grid and building optimization, green data to address energy consumption related to data, AI, and other sort of forms of performance computing. And then from a mitigation standpoint, there's a lot of activity around microgrids, emergency response technologies, climate risk analytics, logistics and supply chain resilience, it runs the gamut, controlled environmental agriculture. I think, again, it's a little bit of a cop-out answer, but it really, I think all of the above.
Makes sense. And we would have a lot of opportunities of investment in all those areas that you mentioned, I believe. But not all the areas are impacted the same, I would assume. So renewable energy, for example, has grown exponentially, and the prices were driven down. I think the windmills are a great example. But other sectors don't have much of a linear growth or cost opportunity incentives for change. For example, house refurbishment and switching to clean technologies that already exist and they are there, but it's still lagging behind because that would force people to act on it. And a lot of people are not incentivized to do it. So with that in mind, what do you think are technologies that have matured, and what do you think are technologies that are still growing and have more room for change?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, renewable energy obviously is an existing technology that has scaled significantly and is a big driver of investment volume. I think something like 50% of all energy transition investments are focused on renewable energy. But I would say, electrified transport is quickly catching up. It's the investment rates in electrified transport are 10 times the rate now of renewable energy. It's growing at 10 times the rate, sorry. And had sort of reached over 270 billion last year. So that soon may overtake renewable energy. So clearly that's an area that's starting to really mature as well. But even within renewable energy, I would say there are other kinds of technologies that are still newer. And so, offshore wind is a great example of this. Wind turbines that can generate power from mid-layer turbulent winds. We also still need energy storage solutions that can store power for longer periods of time, not just, we still need them to smooth out daily fluctuations as well, but we also don't have the technology for the really longer term storage solutions. And
as they say, the wind will not always blow, the sun will not always shine.
Exactly. And we've seen that in certain emergency situations where we've needed longer term storage solutions, not just daily, the sort of technology to smooth out the daily fluctuations. And so there's conversations around storing energy as compressed air or hydrogen or in insulated piles of rock and sand. So there's a lot of innovation happening there. And in terms of other trends, electrify everything technologies. I mean, that's just a massive effort. For example, heat pumps are much more cost efficient and have been around for a really long time. But to your point about not the right incentives, governments are now starting to provide subsidies to offset the upfront cost to replace those gas boilers. And we really have reached a tipping point for EVs. The general consensus is that when you achieve 5 to 10% market share, that's when you can really start to expect rapid adoption. And globally, EVs represent 9% of car sales worldwide. So we're there. I mean, that's 17% in Europe, 16% in China, and even 5% here in the US. So it's clear that we're going to achieve mass conversion to electric vehicles. And as a result, there will be, of course, deployment of associated charging infrastructure. So the next step on that is advanced EVs, and not just cars, but two-wheelers like motorcycles and mopeds, and buses and trucks, and sustainable fuels for planes and cargo ships. So I guess I'll just mention the last thing is the newest area, or one of the newer areas of conversation is around biodiversity. Over half of the world's $80 trillion global economy is reliant on services that come from nature. And, climate change is not just about carbon emissions. It is also, it also destroys ecosystems and accelerates loss of biodiversity and species extinction. And so that really threatens a lot. Think about the agriculture, the food, forest, fisheries that humans rely on. And so we really need to think about how the climate crisis and biodiversity are inextricably linked as well, and how, addressing one can help solve the other. And so we're hearing a lot of interest and focus on nature-based solutions like carbon sequestration in soils and forests, and that may be the next big thing.
So it looks like we're trying to fight a vicious circle and transform it into a virtuous circle. So getting to a point where people are going to start adapting to those new technologies. And people are actually starting to see more how those technology works and how they can be implemented, right? So considering the climate risk awareness, especially considering investors, what is Wetherby's approach to climate change conversation? When you first get an investor, how much are they aware of the problem? How much they would like to actually act on it? And is it more the conversation that you have? Is it more focused on climate opportunity, or is it more focused on climate risks for their portfolio, or maybe both?
Yeah, I mean, we really approach it much more holistically. So I think there, if you were a firm that was focused exclusively on climate, I could certainly understand why your approach might be different. But we talk about it holistically alongside other impact issues, because as I mentioned earlier, I do think there's an opportunity to approach that work in that much more holistic way. So rather than focusing on one issue to the exclusion of other impact considerations, really recognizing that these issue areas are inextricably linked. And so, we do approach the conversation in that sense. And I think we're fortunate enough to have clients that really understand that. And that resonates with them. With that said, climate, as I mentioned, I do think is all encompassing and is cross-cutting. And so we really do think about and talk about climate risk as a lens across all investments, given the impact on financial and economic systems. But we also do look for those opportunities where climate change is a theme, because we recognize there's an opportunity to generate alpha by focusing on climate solutions specifically, and not just taking the risk perspective.
And I imagine that might also differ. You said, well, that's all across investments, but there's also investment themes around climate change and new technologies that might come up. So I'm assuming there might be a difference between investment focus and stage. Maybe early stage, more innovative investments have an approach and versus investing in public companies and more established companies. If you can comment a little bit about how, from an investment perspective, you would consider those different stages.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly there's sort of a risk reward differential of taking sort of binary technology risk or commercialization risk with earlier stage companies in the private markets, but also clearly there's an opportunity to participate in really scaled proven technologies in the public markets. From an asset allocation perspective, the approach might shift in terms of the risk lens versus the opportunity, right? Like that balance might differ. So I'll just speak from our perspective, or our approach. Typically, for us within the public markets, we are taking a much broader based approach, because we're looking for diversified market exposure in the public market. So in that case, our focus might be much more on sort of identifying and addressing the physical asset and transition risks that face these large publicly traded multinational companies. But then within the private markets, where we're much more accustomed to taking active, concentrated bets, that's probably where we'll be more focused on. It doesn't absolve us of paying attention to risks, of course, but it would be where we would focus much more on thematic opportunities in emerging innovations and new economy businesses in climate tech.
And some other questions come to mind. We've been talking a lot about opportunities of investments, but there's also some pushbacks to that strategy. Some investors might consider it a suboptimal investment strategy, or where. So first, where do you think this argument comes from, if it stands until today? Because we've seen early investments in climate having difficulties that we might not be seeing it right now. Did it change or not? And another question that comes to mind is impact-focused strategies. Do you require investors to give up returns?
Yeah, I mean, I think, that's been a myth that has been out there for quite some time. And that's something the impact investing industry has battled over the last 20 years or so. I think, the origins of it, I think, come really from a lot of misperceptions and assumptions and frankly, a lack of understanding of the historical context. So, it is fair to say, the impact investing ESG industry has its roots in socially responsible investing, which, per its name, was really much more focused on values, personal values and values alignment versus fundamental value, which might have delivered subpar performance in the past. But over time, really, the industry has evolved significantly. And I'd say 2 decades ago, really began focusing more on how external ESG and sustainable issues can actually affect financial performance, while also looking at a company's impact on society, people and planet. And so we really do believe that integrating ESG and other impact considerations into our investment analyses can lead to better financial outcomes, whether in the form of reduced risk or enhanced returns. And we think we have a comparative advantage here, because I think that focusing on impact can help identify risks and opportunities that other investors are not paying attention to or recognizing. And I think, we've gotten to the point now in the industry where there's a lot of both academic and practitioner evidence that shows that, including our own experience, by the way, and our own investments, that suggests that incorporating impact considerations into our investment process can result in better financial outcomes in the long term. And that's, I think, especially true for climate. And so I think the other thing to keep in mind is that it's wonderful to be held to a higher standard. I think, if you have the intentionality to create impact, you should absolutely be held to that higher standard. But there's dispersion of returns in all industries, including impact. And that's not exclusive to impact. That is true for traditional investments, as we well know, as well.
Yeah. And it also seems that investors are focusing much on return and less focused on the risk part of the investments, as you said. Like, I think you mentioned this a few times in the call today. And consider the we're increasingly subject to long tail climate related events across the planet. So we're talking about droughts, wildfires, floods, and many others. How would you consider the risk management that you discussed before would play a role in the efficiency of a comprehensive impact investing strategy? How would that make a difference when the investor considers not only the return part of the investment, but also the risk assessment, the risk awareness that you're bringing to the table?
Yeah, well, it's simple math, right? You lose 50%, you have to make more than 50% to make up for that, right? So, prevention of permanent capital loss is a key part of risk management. And I think that climate clearly has an impact on that. So, but I, as I noted before, I really do think risk management around climate needs to go beyond an impact investing strategy, meaning it shouldn't be housed just within an impact investing strategy. I think, even if you aren't interested in the thematic approach of identifying those opportunities in which the impact thesis or the impact strategy drives a fundamental investment thesis, you still have to be paying attention to the systemic risks presented by the climate crisis. So no one's saying that the only way to make money is by addressing climate solutions. We think it's a great place to make money, but again, even if you aren't focused on making money in that way, all of your investments are exposed to the risks. So, I mean, but to be fair, those risks are really difficult to quantify. You already noted that they're long-tailed risk, and absolutely, I mean, we do think that, so they're hard to quantify, but we do think that the risks are undeniably substantial. And we also, it's clear that the market has not yet fully priced in all of those risks. And again, to be clear, we definitely do not have all the answers. I would say it's still a work in progress for us. But there's a lot of smart people in the industry working on developing the kinds of frameworks and systems and tools to help better understand and quantify those risks. And so there's still a lot of work to be done, but our approach has really been to push our managers on the topic in the hopes that we can move forward together as a field.
Yeah, maybe move away from carbon being the only metrics to a more broad metric on how we're impacting the planet and how that impact can actually reverse and influence the returns and the investments. So last question before we move on to our Q&A. And if you'd like to ask a question, now it's a good time to do so. Please post it on the Q&A box. Creating a long carbon economy is subject to intense criticism. Some Republicans view it as more of a government intervention and more spending. There's also pushbacks from the fossil fuel industries that obviously get to lose if we actually move our energy to renewable sources. And also in the consumer side, there's criticisms on the lack of transparency or credibility related to, well, some players in the industry practicing greenwashing and, well, not actually acting as they say. I'd like you to comment a little bit on that resistance, how that may impact Wetherby, how you have seen this impact the industry, and how maybe we can help establish, move on from those critics and maybe try to establish a broader conversation within our society.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, just sort of tackling the criticism from the right first. In some ways, it means the industry has actually grown enough has garnered enough mainstream attention and success to actually become a target. But unfortunately, clearly a lot of it is based on misconceptions, and it does seem as though the narrative is being driven primarily by politicians that are looking to generate that kind of media attention and position themselves, frankly, for a 2024 presidential run. I mean, it's a cynical view, but I think it's quite accurate. I would just say, as an aside, the whole sort of fossil fuel divestment kind of conversation, the fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel production has been subsidized for decades. I mean, hundreds of years. In 2021 alone, they received $700 billion in subsidies. I mean, which was a record high, despite the amount of public commitments that governments have made to end fossil fuel subsidies and to adhere to the Paris Agreement and accelerate this transition to a low carbon economy. So, I would say that the fossil fuel subsidies clearly, unfortunately, have not gone away. And so I think in terms of the message and the way that we think about it is we just need to, as an industry and ourselves, is continue to reiterate that this is truly a financially material issue, and therefore, is a part of our fiduciary responsibility to our clients. And, this is to emphasize again that this is not politically motivated and shouldn't be politicized. And in fact, there's a lot of conversation about the US's competitiveness, and really addressing climate can be a source of innovation and competitive advantage for the US vis-a-vis other countries in the world. So, again, depoliticizing the narrative and helping people understand why this is important for all stakeholders is important. And so on greenwashing, I think I have a slightly different perspective. I think it's just usually the case. It's really not that black and white. I do think some of the criticism is absolutely fair and warranted, but also some of the points are clearly taken to extreme in order to stir the pot and generate press and more eyeballs. But I would have said 5-10 years ago that I thought it was more important to build a big tent to really drive momentum in the space. But I think it really is time for some real accountability, and we're seeing that now. And in our own process, we have never invested based solely on the marketing or labeling of a strategy. We think it's imperative that we all do our work properly in the same way that we conduct our financial due diligence. We should also be conducting the same level of rigor around the impact due diligence, understanding the strategy, the approach, the track record, the accountability mechanisms in place to ensure that we're not greenwashing. And and the SEC is already playing a role here, and we really do think the SEC is, we think it's positive what they're doing, both the effort to create greater transparency and increase consistency information available through their proposed rules, as well as the effort to crack down on greenwashing and misleading claims. So all of that, I think, is a positive development in the space, and we in the industry need to continue to hold ourselves accountable to continuous improvement.
And it's a growing industry, right? There's a lot of learning in the process, I imagine.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think we should never rest on our laurels and really recognize there's always opportunities for improvement.
Thank you, Justina. So now we're moving to questions from the audience. I have a question here about the best strategy for climate investing. If we consider a more conservative approach, is it investing in public companies? There are taking into consideration climate risks and transitioning their infrastructure versus companies that aren't, shifting the focus, companies that are still relying on strategies and businesses that really impact the planet. So I imagine this question is concerning, well, if we're not ready yet to invest in those new technologies, innovative technologies, and want to invest in the public markets, would that be the best strategy? How would you tackle that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it depends on, I think if you're investing in diversified portfolios or assembling and constructing diversified portfolios, you should really be thinking about risks and opportunities across asset classes, or at a minimum risks. But I mean, in terms of a more conservative approach, if you're not yet ready to invest in sort of the thematic opportunities, or you don't want to take that kind of early stage risk, there actually are opportunities within the most conservative asset class, like cash. At the most basic level, you can place cash with banks that don't fund fossil fuel companies. I mean, that is massive exposure on their balance sheets. It's a big credit risk. And so, you might not want your cash going to those kinds of projects. And so, fixed income, historically one of the more stable asset classes, less so this year, but invest in bonds that are issued by issuers like companies or municipalities that are accounting for climate risks, which again is particularly important from a credit risk perspective. And then, perhaps if you're not comfortable with investing in a really early stage business with binary technology risk, you can invest in green bonds and blue bonds. These are issued by companies or governments where the use of proceeds will be specifically for, in the case of green bonds, for renewable energy projects or other sustainability projects. In the case of blue bonds, things like ocean conservation or sustainable fisheries.
I think you go back to your point where we need to assess the risk, the climate risk from all aspects, including fixed income, including other types of investments. There's a question here about the war in Ukraine and geopolitical perspective. How does it impact investment focus? And I would add to that question, the problems now in Europe that they have started the transition to more renewable energy sources, and they were kind of caught up in between. So the war happened, they were still reliant on gas from Russia. So yeah, I would add, how do you think like that has impacted the transition, and how do you think they would respond to that? One thing that comes to mind for me is, well, that might accelerate the transition, but there also might hinder it, because people will obviously get mad if they're being impacted.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. It's complicated, of course. I mean, I think what it doesn't necessarily change the focus. I mean, the sort of the fundamental backdrop still exists in terms of having to limit temperature, warming to 1.5 degrees. But I think what it does is it just highlights the danger of fossil fuel dependency, and just increases the urgency to make this energy transition. And it actually, interestingly enough, creates alignment in climate leadership and energy security. So people are suddenly talking about renewable energy in terms of energy security terms instead of just climate terms. And so the hope is that it will accelerate the deployment of renewable energy and development of new technologies like clean hydrogen, and that the government will really invest in that. And again, the hope is that while there may be some short-term dislocations, over the longer term, enabling policy can support rapid scaling. And in fact, again, going back to the sort of competitiveness of regions, the EU has an opportunity to develop climate solutions. I mean, by being forced to do so, which can then be exported and expanded geographically, creating a competitive advantage for them. So I think the short answer is I have no idea what's going to happen. But I can tell you, but that's what I hope will happen.
Yeah, that's good. We all hope that something good can come up of the crisis. So there's also a question about the due diligence that you mentioned that you do with your managers. The question is related to, what do you think is important in assessing the managers and how they're handling the impact investing in general, climate more focused? I know you can't get much of the specifics, but you can get us a broad perspective on how do you do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really not too different from how you think about financial due diligence. So some of broad framing, it's really first understanding what the impact strategy is, and then how it drives a fundamental investment thesis. Whether it's thematically oriented or ESG integration oriented, understanding what is the investment conviction here, and what underpins that, and ensuring that it really is fully integrated, not just a byproduct. But there's real sort of there's real alignment, and that it's an integral part of the investment thesis. And then, similarly, it's understanding the team. What is their ability to execute on that strategy? What does their prior experience suggest in terms of track record and experience and their ability to execute? And then it's, accountability. How do we ensure that there's no strategy drift around that? How do we ensure that they're holding themselves accountable to that? And it's not just about a one-way flow of information in terms of reporting, but information that's actually useful for us to be able to ask better questions of our managers and make sure we understand how they're incorporating the lessons learned themselves into their own processes. And so, that's really the broad frame. And I think, when we think about ESG, we're asking our managers about their ESG approach, their ESG policies and procedures, what kind of accountability mechanisms they have in place, and who is involved in all of that, what kind of resources they have available. For DEI, it's very similar, DEI policies and procedures, but also, what does your team actually look like? And then, what is your approach to climate risk and opportunities? Do you conduct scenario analysis? Do you have an understanding of what the major climate risks are to your particular investment strategy, whether it's physical asset risk and or transition risk? Have you thought about that, and do you have an approach towards managing that? And there are industry efforts that you can look to as standards or best practices, like the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, project drawdown. So you can start asking managers or investees about how they fit within that larger industry context and how they're utilizing those kinds of frameworks and tools in their own processes.
Great, thank you. So we have another question here about how nature-based solutions are nature inherent standard deviation covariance of around 25+%, which is impeding the use of measurement, reporting, and verification. What level of accuracy in climate benefits do you expect to see or documented in investments? Are trees that anyway would not have been cut making the hurdle?
Sorry, what was the last piece of that question? Are
trees that anyway would not have been cut making the hurdle? Like trees that would actually not, people would not go there, cut the trees. Are they making the hurdle?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the source of capital that you're talking about. Ultimately, we're investors and we are only investing in those opportunities in which we believe we can deliver a risk-adjusted rate of return or better to our clients, right? So we're really looking for those opportunities where that impact is what again drives that investment thesis and could result in better outcomes for our clients. So you're absolutely right that we're not there yet on a lot of these nature-based solutions. There's a lot of sort of innovation in that space, and I am hopeful that we'll eventually get there. I mean, there are really creative investment structures, though. I'll give you an example of sustainable timber, where there are sustainable forestry managers out there that of course are sort of thinking about the right, not clear cutting, but managing forests sustainably that then do generate yield from the sale of forest products. But there are also those that are selling certain plots of land like forestry into permanent conservation. So it's a sort of it's a market solution, but ultimately the buyer of those conservation or the buyer of that land putting it into permanent conservation are public entities like the government or the Trust for Public Land or the Nature Conservancy that is funded by philanthropy or public good, because the problem is that, or the thing is, this is like the classic tragedy of the commons, where the benefits, the positive externalities that are created by conservation and other nature-based solutions accrue to humanity and the planet writ large, rather than to a single investor, for example. And so this is really where the government needs to step in to force the internalization of negative externalities and allow investors to benefit from the internalization of positive externalities that are created by certain investments. And that's part of the premise of impact investing and part of the need for public entities to step in where there is that sort of diffusion of both costs as well as benefits.
Yeah, it's hard when the negative externality costs zero, right? So
that's what carbon markets are meant to do, is to force the internalization of the negative externalities that are created by those kinds of carbon emissions and pollution that come from companies need to be forced to pay the true cost of doing their business, because that is a cost that is borne by all of us.
There's another question here about the metrics or scores that you use to measure ESG impacts of companies and investments. I think you mentioned a little bit when you talked about due diligence, but is there anything different you'd like to add to that?
I would say that we don't, we look at ESG ratings and scores, but we definitely do not rely on them. They are one data point. So I think, like anything else, there should be both a qualitative as well as a quantitative assessment. In the same way that you don't make an investment purely based on a risk and return number, you certainly shouldn't be making an investment based purely on an ESG rating or metric. And so, again, it's one data point in our overall process, but we look at a lot of qualitative factors as well.
There's another question about emerging regulation. I think the SEC 1500, and in a broader sense, how we can bring truth to advertising. I imagine advertising the impact investments, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's part of the goal of this regulation. And it's interesting because some of the proposed SEC regulations are actually not new rules. They're just reiteration of existing rules like truth in advertising. I mean, truth in advertising, the names rule that the SEC has proposed, for example, is, I mean, it's basically just a reiteration that truth in advertising also applies to ESG, and rightly so. That should be true of all investments. You shouldn't say you're a small cap fund if you're not a small cap fund, or it shouldn't be in your name. And likewise, sustainability or ESG shouldn't be if that's not truly a principle that you adhere to in a consistent, repeatable process. And so I think it's a really positive development. I think, the US's regulatory approach has been largely around disclosure and transparency. So again, more information is never a bad thing for investors. And the EU has taken a bit more of a aggressive is the wrong word, but the EU has been more focused on standards beyond just disclosure. And so it's been interesting to see kind of the results in the EU of thousands of funds voluntarily delisting themselves as, or not delisting, identifying themselves as sustainable, even ones that they felt like they couldn't reach the light green Article 8 standards. So it just tells you how rampant that challenge was. But again, to your point earlier, Isabelle, I think it's a function of a newer market that just needs some time to shake out, and that's a positive thing for there to be greater discernment and quality over time.
Yeah, perfect. So last question before we close, because we're running a little bit out of time. It's about, as we're here in California, in San Francisco. So how do you think, is this different here? Because we're pioneers in this. We've been doing this for so long, not only the government, but also Silicon Valley investment firms investing in, not only venture firms, investing in the climate for so long. How do you think, very briefly, this is different before we close the webinar?
Yeah. I mean, as you noted, California has long been a climate and clean energy leader. I mean, renewable energy is the fastest growing business in the state, but I think, if it were happening just in the state alone, it wouldn't mean much. I mean, more importantly is California's ability to influence beyond California itself. And, California is the 5th largest economy in the world. Some people say we're about to be the 4th largest, overtaking Germany soon. So, the standards we set around clean energy and zero emission vehicles and other sort of regulations move entire industries. There's not a car company in the world that wants to build different cars for California versus other markets. I mean, it just doesn't make sense for them to do so. So it's a really important market mover or industry mover. And then I would say, California's cap and trade program, which we launched back in 2013, is one of the largest multi-sector emissions trading systems in the world. And that the carbon allowances market here really provides a strong demonstration of good climate policy that can reduce emissions that other jurisdictions can replicate and adopt. So I think it's really important, the template that California provides to other parts of the world. And our
great. Yeah, that's true. Thank you, Justina, so much for participating in the webinar. I will pass it on to Eric for the closing remarks.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you all for attending today's dynamic discussion, and a special thank you to Justina for sharing your wisdom with our society, and for Isabelle for moderating the conversation. Again, thank you so much for participating, and enjoy the rest of your day.